Down. Okay, sorry.
Oh.
And you're live.
Good evening and welcome to Short Stories Spectacular. My name is Madeleine Sonic and I'm going to be the moderator tonight. Thank you to Caitlin Press for providing the venue this evening and to our producers, Monica Miller and Ashley. We have three very, very interesting authors with us tonight, each of them with a new book of short fiction. And all three live in British Columbia, which I think is clearly a hotbed of literary talent. Their publishers are also from the Canadian West. Thank you to Anvil Press and Caitlin Press of British Columbia and Signature Editions of Manitoba for bringing us these wonderful books. And thank you too to the BC Arts Council, the Manitoba Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Government of Canada for supporting these books in particular and for being such champions of Canadian literature. So the great thing about a COVID event is that you can digitally whisper all through the event, all through our conversation. You can be commenting on the side of the screen. That's great. We love to see them. We hope to have time for a few audience questions at the end. It depends on how loquacious these women are. But I think we'll probably squeeze a couple in. Also, I hope you noted on the side that there will be a draw at the end of three winners will each get a copy of one of the books, randomly selected, and I will announce it at the very end of the event, which should last an hour. I'm going to be bringing the writers on stage one at a time, alphabetically, so you can meet them individually, and then we'll be talking together as a group about short fiction, about their particular approaches and themes, and the special delights and challenges of writing short prose. In the course of the hour, you will hear each of them read from their book, a short little sample, which I think will prove that short fiction is far from being an appetizer to long fiction. Short stories are meaty little nuggets all on their own. So without further, nobody's telling me to stop, that something is going horribly wrong. So I'm just going to carry on. Our first author tonight is Jenny Gunn. Jenny is a, can we have Jenny on the screen? Perfect. Okay, thank you. Jenny is an author, a musician, a translator from Italian to English, which may not be entirely surprising since she was born in Italy and moved to Canada when she was 11. She's published 3 novels, including Solitaria, which was nominated for the Scotiabank Giller. She's also published 2 poetry collections, a collection of personal essays, and an opera libretto. And although she's no longer on the road, she spent many years crisscrossing Canada as a professional musician, playing bass guitar, piano, and fronting several different bands as a singer. And if any of you know her, she has probably burst into song at some point. Permanent Tourist, which was just launched a couple of weeks ago, is her 3rd collection of short fiction. So welcome, Jenny. Can you tell us a few words, introduce Permanent Tourist to our audience in, the elevator pitch?
Okay, so it's a collection of stories, 8 stories that are linked by, the characters are linked through loss, essentially, and I would say longing as well. Longing, they each are longing, possibly even trying to find their own identities in the world. The tourist part, the title, Permanent Tourist, these are not tourists as in people who are touring around looking at stuff. They are, although the stories do take place in a lot of different locations. So these are tourists who move, but they move for different reasons. They're searching for things about themselves. They're escaping from things. They're looking for things. And I was thinking of tourists in the sense of the P.K. Page poem of Permanent Tourists, which where she talks about the permanent tourists who take their photographs in front of all sorts of monuments without ever entering into the actual full experience. So I see these characters are characters who are trying to enter into their own experiences, and yet they remain somehow tourists even in their own lives.
Right. Thank you. That's that. We look forward to talking more about that.
Okay.
The next to come on stage is Mary Mcdonald. So, Mary, are you there? You are. Hi, Mary.
And Marilyn said, "Hold your book."
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Buy books, hold books. So we can hold books. Yes.
My book is called The Crooked Thing, and a lot of people have said to me, "What does that mean?" And it's a quote from W.B. Yeats, the poet, and the quote is, "Love is the crooked thing. Not everyone is wise enough to know all that is in it." And it's a collection of 17 short stories, and they're all love stories. They're all people looking for love of a partner, a sibling, a parent, a child, self, love of self. But for each of them, there's something else going on. And the something else is often what life is, isn't it? It's grief, sadness, trauma, sorrow, longing, regret, all the things that kind of get in the way of coming to love. And William Blake said something that I think was brilliant back in 1803. And he said, "Joy and woe are woven fine." And it is that for me. And then I think it is that for all the characters in the story, that if they're going to find their path to love, they're going to have to, in some way, come to know or embrace or find their way through the sadness and the grief and the longing and the to healing, really, because I don't really think you can have one without the other.
Well, thank you. And now I'm going to introduce you. It's backwards, but that's okay.
Oh, okay.
So Mary is a poet. She began as a poet. She began writing poetry. She's written poetry for ballet, public art, and a libretto. And she published a chapbook called Going In Now. And she divides her time between Vancouver and Whistler. Are you in Whistler right now or in Vancouver?
I'm in Vancouver, where it's lovely and raining.
Right. Okay. But in Whistler, she's involved with the writing group, The Vicious Circle, and sits on the board of the Whistler Writers Festival, where you curate the poetry events for the festival. Your short fiction up till now has been published in Room magazine, but it's been collected now for the first time in this debut collection, The Crooked Thing, which was also launched just a couple of weeks ago in Whistler. So welcome, Mary.
Thank you.
And our third author this evening is Madeleine Sonic. Hi, Madeleine. So Madeleine, and you match. That's excellent. We like that. Madeleine, you are joining us from Vancouver Island, I think. Is that correct?
Yes.
Where she teaches at the University of Victoria. She's widely published in a range of genres. She's released an adult novel, a children's novel, 2 poetry collections, and a volume of personal essays that was a finalist for the BC National Award for Canadian Nonfiction. And that book also won the City of Victoria Book Prize. Fontainebleau is her second collection of short fiction, and you've already seen the wonderful cover. So yes, ta-da! So welcome, Madeleine, and can you set up your book for the audience?
Yeah. So my book is called Fontainebleau, and it's a mythical city that I created. But it very much parallels the city of Windsor in Ontario, which was the place that I grew up. I call it the place I grew up. I lived there for 4 years, but it was my growing up time. And Fontainebleau was a subdivision I lived in, but I turned it into a city, used a lot of the same street names as Windsor, but it gave me a nice geography to build my stories around. And I have 17 stories in this linked collection. Each story is a read on its own, but if you read them all the way through, there's a narrative arc that will take you to another dimension of what the book is about. So that was very, very challenging and very interesting to do. And I tried to create in this linked collection, a linked collection that has stories from every different genre I could think of. So there would be a hard-boiled detective, and there would be a retold fairy tale. So I wanted to do that, but I also wanted to join them so when the reader was reading them, they wouldn't realize that these were all disparate forms. So
Right.
yeah, that's it.
Oh.
That's my book.
Okay, thank you very much. So my first question to all of you, as you will have noticed and the audience will have noticed, you are all poets as well as prose writers. And so I'm going to throw this out to Jenny first, but I'm interested in how all of you move among genres and why this particular material demanded to be stories. So in your own lives, which came first, poetry or stories? And what does your poetic background bring to your story writing? So kick it off, Jenny.
Okay. I think I began in two different ways. I've been writing probably forever, since I was a very small child. So I used to write little tiny baby stories of things. So that was always part of it. And actually, unlike maybe what a lot of school students do, which is to write a lot of poetry, I actually was writing little stories rather than poems. However, when I kind of got serious about it, I think I did begin as a poet, but mainly because I loved language so much. And so poetry lends itself to, obviously, the playing with language and doing all of that. And I hope that in the end, that is what I can bring into the prose. What I think for me, like I do, as you know, novels, stories, prose, but it seems to me that everything has its own place. So, for example, perhaps a short story has its own idea, but it's either too big for a poem or too small for a novel. So it's a short story. Not that I think of it that way, but it feels to me like in my head, I don't sort of think of an idea and go, or should this be it just seems natural that, oh, this is a story. So it's some sort of, it happens naturally, I think, rather than think. But I do think that working with poetry makes me very aware of language, and also translation, I think, is part of that, because I spend so many hours inside dictionaries and thesauruses and trying to figure out what word I really want to use. So all of that, it lends itself to poetry as well.
Right. What about you, Madeleine?
I with Jenny on that, I think language, and I've always been fascinated, by language. And I think that goes back, to my childhood when my father would pay me a nickel to learn a new word, right? A 3-syllable word or a 4-syllable word. And I just, really fell in love with the sound and what it could actually do. And I guess as I developed as a writer, language became far more important. I kind of see it now that it's got to be right. Like I know a lot of people write and then they go back and then they edit. But when I'm writing, the language has to be right before I can move forward. It's like a brick road, That's how I feel. So I do think that it's all interconnected, the poet, the short story writer, and even the nonfiction writer.
And did I read someplace that your background is Russian?
Yes. Yeah, that was my father's side of the family. My mother was British.
Oh, so did you learn Russian when you were young or anything like that?
No. I learned a few words, but no, not no, I didn't learn it wholly.
Yeah. And Mary, up until these stories, you've mostly been working in poetry. So what was the driving force to move into prose?
Well, there are days, Marilyn, when I think I'm still writing poetry. I'm a slow writer, and I'm chiseling all the time. And I'm that kind of person that could go back and rewrite that first sentence 1,000 times. So that said, you know what, though? I'm a curious person. And poetry kind of has its limitations in that domain, I think. And one of the stories in my books came from a little clip that was on CBC Radio one day. I was in the car. And it was the guy that steals his aqua ferry, his little water taxi, 14 horsepower water taxi from Granville Island, and thinks he's going to take it to Hawaii. And that was all we got, you know. And I Googled later, and who is this, and what was he thinking, and how far could you go in a 14 horsepower? I know nothing about horsepower. And I asked a bunch of people I know, and they said, well, you could not get to Vancouver Island, but the guy got to Tofino. So that's pretty amazing, if you guys know where Tofino is. So, you know, then I just thought, well, who would do that? Who takes, that's his job, right? He's the pilot of the water taxi. Who takes it one day, points it west, and decides, I'm going to Kauai, man. So it just stuck with me. Things stick with me like that. And I think somebody said to me once, if something sticks to you and it's there and it's there and it's there and you just can't let go of it, there's a story there, right?
Yeah.
And we make it up, of course, but I'm interested in, why does somebody do these things? That's just a curiosity.
So this is a great segue. I wonder if you could read a wee bit from The Crooked Thing.
And I wasn't going to read about the ferry.
No, that's okay. You don't have to read about the ferry.
I could, but anyway, I'm reading from the last story in the book called The New Dinner. And I don't think it needs an introduction, by the way, so I'm just going to go forward. On the short walk from the car to the back door of our house, I surveyed the garden, surprised to see tiny buds and sprouts coming to life. Before we left for the mountains, the earth had been hard and impenetrable. Now leaves brightened the backyard. Without thinking about all there was to do in the house, I returned to the garage for a rake. I'd forgotten how fond I was of going to the garden after work, finishing my day, weeding, snipping, tilling the soil. Milo needed no invitation. He was already exploring, smelling, chasing scents of mice or city rats, squirrels perhaps, his nose wedged under the fence, looking for intruders who had passed through while we'd been away. Even before I turned the earth, I caught myself naming things: air, wind, breath, space, things I could not see. That image of Nate shuffling with the bags brought back a memory of the dream I'd had the night before. There was a figure walking on the flat savanna, drenched in light, clutching a battered suitcase. The kind of mythical scene where grasses part and form a thin dust bowl of a road, no beginning or end. The walker reminded me of a drifter, going nowhere in particular. His ragged, ill-fitting clothing picked up at the last camp, perhaps, where he stopped for the night. As he came closer, I was seized by his green eyes, Nate's eyes. I was bothered then to see him dragging one leg noisily down the road. But he went by me with a dignity as though the parched grassland was what he knew, as though we'd never known each other at all.
Thank you. We miss the audience participation.
I
here.
know.
We miss the applause.
We do.
So we will all do the applause for you. Thank you. So that figure with a battered suitcase is, I mean, that's a iconic of not only your collection, but it makes me think of the role of place in all three collections. Place has a large role. How in yours, Mary, you moved from Canada to France to Tanzania to Norway and back again. What's the role of place? Is it just a narrative driver, or how do you see place in these stories?
Such a good question, because I probably don't know enough to have a narrative driver in a debut collection. You know what? I just have I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to write, and it's pitch black. And, you know, in the winter in Whistler, it might be -19 and blowing like crazy, and there's nobody up. And so I'm kind of half awake, to be honest. And I'm kind of half dreaming, half awake. I don't know. And I've traveled a lot, but, you know, there's places in my book I have not traveled to. So it's kind of funky. But anyway, so I'm in this kind of liminal place, right? In the morning at 4 o'clock, having my 2 shots of espresso before I get down on the clickety-clack. And things just go. And I'm not the person, you know, I think we vary, don't we, in terms of how we approach a story. There are people who plot a story and they know where it's going and they know where it's going to end, and they're super organized. I'm not that person. I'm like so loose. I just have one line, you know, up on my clickety-clack, one line. I wonder if that might go make a story. I'm thinking, huh. And then I've had my 2 shots of espresso and something happens and I just go, and I don't know why. I don't know why am I.
I think it must be Italian espresso. And that's what makes you travel.
I don't know. I don't know. But off I go, and I wander into these places. And sometimes I have to ground them, because that's the poet in me too, right?
Right.
You have to ground it enough for the reader to go, oh, that's a story. It isn't just some kind of, you know, free-form thing this lady thinks she can write, and we get what the heck she's talking about. So I have to rein it in sometimes. But yeah, that's the best way I can answer the question.
And Jenny, your collection is all about place, right? That's a major theme.
Yeah.
So tell us how place figures in them.
Well, place is very important for me in 2 different ways. I mean, one is I'm a total traveler, so I've been to all the places that are in the book, and sometimes some of the stories are spurred on by something that happened in one of those places, just some image, some event, whatever. But beyond that, and I think more importantly for me, place is metaphor. Place becomes a metaphor for something much larger, for a human condition of some kind. And the earth, I'm extremely fascinated anyway by just the earth and the physical place, the physicality of the earth itself, and the layers, everything. All our human emotions are somehow perfectly reflected in all of that landscape. And so in this collection, for example, I think there are 3 geologists. There are a lot of stones and rocks in it, because and they do function very much metaphorically throughout the story. So I do, yeah, I think a lot about place. I think a lot about place, and it has to be exactly the right place for whatever the story is telling. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And Madeleine, yours is in a way the most static of these 3 collections, in that it takes place pretty much in one place, but it seems to me like a lot of the people are trying to leave.
Yeah.
Also.
That's true. I'm just going to show something too. I've got a little map on the inside if you want to see Fontainebleau.
Yeah. And I recognize Willette Street. And
yes,
Quebec.
all of them.
Yeah.
For me, in this particular collection, the geography has an emotional resonance. And I discovered when I went back to Windsor to be the writer in residence at the university there for a term, I went to old haunts, you know, and it brought everything back. It was like the most amazing experience, you know, that toboggan hills. And I remember, you know, I could see us as kids. It was amazing, you know. So I know smells bring it back too. Like even there in Windsor, the smells were similar as they had been, but the actual landscape, the geography brought back so much of memories. And many of the memories that I had are in some, you know, in the stories, because they're profound memories. But there's also urban legend that's in this too, you know.
Yeah.
And I wanted to really work with that because that comes back too through the geography, you know, like crop circles and those kind of things, right? And
Yeah.
the cornfields and all of that, you know. So
Yeah.
yeah. So for me, I think it's got this emotional resonance, I'd say.
Right. Would you read a piece from Fontainebleau?
Sure, yeah. I'm going to read from a story called Flight. Laurie Laframboise was pregnant, and Jimmy Robinson stole a car. It was parked outside the Toronto Dominion on Olette Street, 2 blocks from the shop where Jimmy's mother was serving coffee. He didn't really want the car. It was a Ford sedan with rusting fenders. A cardboard air freshener hung from its mirror, and fuzzy plaid covers encased its seats. He drove past the hospital, the library, the funeral home, wondering how far he'd get before the police pulled him over. He wondered if he might make it to Toronto. He'd never been there before, but the starter's gun in his heart was telling him to go. A guy from Essex he'd once done time with at St. Jerome's Wilderness Camp, Jack Goulet, told him Toronto was a good place to get lost in. The buildings are so tall and the population so copious, said Jack, that as soon as your feet touch pavement, you vanish completely away. Jack was older than Jimmy, knew things and talked funny. He had a synthetic plate in his skull. He'd been the victim of a farm accident in Essex and was at St. Jerome's because he'd shot his parents. Jimmy wondered if he might meet up with Jack again, if he might melt into the very same Toronto pavement that Jack had headed for when he broke from camp so many years ago. Jimmy stopped for a red light at the intersection of Quebec Street. He lit a cigarette and watched a bunch of schoolgirls from Queen Anne's in their ugly pleated skirts getting off a bus. Some had hiked their skirts so high you could see the lace fringe on their bright little panties. The thought occurred he might lure one of these schoolgirls into his car, carry her off to Toronto, maybe take 2, one for him, one for Jack. But then he remembered Laurie, and the light turned green. Green light Laurie, he thought, and began feeling queasy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I thought we'd turn the conversation to form, since also all 3 of you, in one way or another, have linkages between your stories, quite different linkages. But Madeleine, you've talked a little bit about the fact that your stories are linked. Did that idea come at the very beginning, or did it evolve as various stories evolved, or was it part of the initial concept?
No, actually, the idea of linking the stories, it evolved after I realized I was writing stories that were very similar setting, you know, basically Fontainebleau, right? But I didn't really realize that, and then when I did, like I think I had about 3 of them, and I realized that they were all kind of these different genres. And I thought, I wonder if I can put that together, and I wonder if I can kind of put in new genres in this mix, you know. So for me, like I guess always when I'm writing something, there has to be some challenge that I'm trying to do, you know, do something. It's almost like a constraint, you know, that I'm really trying to achieve something, which is create these different stories that there's a feeling of unification between them, even though really there isn't. But I'm trying to make them look that way for the reader, you know, and for the reader to read them and not be aware that they're reading these different different genres, different forms of story. But yeah, that's my linking.
Yeah, and Mary, yours are they. I was wondering if they're written as standalones, because the linkage really is through the first person narrator, right? Who, you know, is going through these various things. So Did you work that in later? Were you aware when you were writing those stories that it was the same narrator? Was that intentional, or like from the beginning, or did it come later?
It wasn't intentional.
Yeah, I'm getting that idea.
But you know, it'll be interesting. And I'm fascinated by this thing. And I think this happens a lot more than we think. As readers, we know this. John Irving says that every story he's written is about his father.
Yeah.
Every story. And I think as a reader, you wouldn't necessarily know that, right?
Yeah.
And I think every story, and possibly every poem I've written, is thematically the same. They're all about loss and regret and forgiveness, and how do we go through that? How do we become better people? How do we face our own dark side and not shy away from it, not be afraid of it, and kind of walk into it? And I think that's probably just so much a belief system for me and the way I see the world, that darn if it's not in there. I look at the end of a story and I think, I started this one way and it's turned out to be the same darn thing.
So though that same narrator was accidental.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's one story in the collection that's not told in the first person. But she suffers, right? It's the girl who loses whose parents. She loses her parents.
Yeah. And Jenny, your linkages are there. It's a bit of a puzzle and a bit of a mystery for the reader to come upon the same name and think, oh, is that the person I read about back there? She's older now. Okay, right. And it's and all these there are intersections, but it's not perhaps as obvious a linkage as setting them all in the same place. Or and how did that evolve for you?
Well, it evolved. I wrote several of the stories, probably 3 or 4 of them separately. But then I began, when I wanted to put the collection together, I looked through and I started to see that, in fact, some of the stories seemed to, even though I hadn't particularly thought of it to begin with, they seemed to be, they seemed to fit. I thought, oh my goodness, look at that character there. Really is the same character as in this other story. Like a minor character in one story is suddenly a major character in another story. And so at that point, I started to work with them together. And so the collection, they're linked, but they're not linear. So as Marilyn just pointed out, I had to make a huge timeline because they take place, they're discrete in themselves, and they're all linked. At one point, all of these people went to a support group for loss. They had all lost someone important or something, and so that's what connected them. But each of the stories they're completely different in terms of, and they do come together at the end as well, right? So I thought it was an interesting way to do it, and also to intersect them somehow, because they are all connected by, as I said, longing as well as loss. I think longing. Yeah.
Would you read us a little bit from?
I will. I'll read you a little bit.
And show us the cover, because you didn't show it when you were introduced. Ta-da!
I forgot to show you the cover. There it is. The piece I'm going to read has nothing to do with this particular thing, although it does in a way have to do with that, I should say. Because it's, well, we'll talk about this after. So I'm reading actually from in the middle of a story. In her real life, Paris is inexplicably drawn to certain people, due perhaps to a recognition of an unspoken similar past. The other night, for example, she'd watched a BBC online video featuring an interview with a medium, a young woman in her late 20s who claimed to have fallen in love with a ghost. Tell us what you talk about, the TV host said, gamely trying to suspend his disbelief. She paused. Well, we don't talk like. It's more of a feeling, an emotion. And you say you fell in love? Can you tell us how this happened? The TV host said through a half smile. Yes, I was in Australia, and while I was walking through the forest one day, he found me. She turned and smiled as if to reassure the ghost beside her. And then? Well, she said, normally spirits are static, so I was very sad when I had to leave him. She smiled shyly. But when I was on the plane home, there he was. What, physically? No, of course not, she said. I can't see him. It's just like a human relationship otherwise. She smiled again. But we did go into the washroom and join the Mile High Club. The TV host leaned forward. What if you're just imagining this? I know it's real, she said firmly, and I don't mind if people disbelieve. What's next then? Marriage? A baby? We're planning a hand fasting. That's the old term, essentially, for a spiritual marriage. A promise. As to the baby, well, there are many phantom pregnancies, and I believe these are real, in that they produce ghost babies. So, you think you'll have a ghost baby, the TV host said, frowning. I don't know whether it'll be physical baby or, well, good luck to you and your ghost lover, the TV host said. Paris felt immediate empathy for this young woman, as one would feel for a lonely child with an imaginary friend. A ghost lover, Paris thinks, is a very attractive prospect. No backtalk, no messy scenes, no unpleasantness. One can conjure and banish him at will, unlike a real man who, like her ex Dean, resists being conjured, doesn't answer his phone, and certainly would never follow her onto a plane. In fact, after 6 months of what Paris thought was a relationship, he has abruptly broken up with her, citing vague excuses, inside which she hears goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have ghost babies and permanent tourists. We have a chambermaid in Fontainebleau who finds her memories vanish when she puts on a stranger's wig. In The Crooked Thing, we have a monk who vanishes into the body of a ferry captain. So it seems that there's a bit of a streak of the fantastic in all of these stories too, the surreal, myth, magic. So Jenny, what prompts you, and I want all of you to talk about this, what prompts you away from conventional, realistic storytelling towards the fantastic, the experimental, etc.?
Well, I think, it's the possibilities of it, right? Now, I just want you to know that scene that I just read, I actually watched a BBC video
It's
in
all
which there
true.
was a real medium. It was so hilarious. I couldn't believe it. Of course, it was much longer, but the gist of it was there, right? So I think I would say there's something wonderful about imagining these other scenarios, these parallel worlds, so to speak. And in some ways, what I tried to do in mine, and there are actually several spots where there's ambiguity, I think, as to whether the magic or whatever the paranormal is happening or not, in that I make sure that the ambiguity is there so that you can imagine, well, it's the character who's just imagining this thing rather than that it really is. But it could also be. So there's that. I like the play of that, right? I like the play of those two, those possibilities, because I think we've all experienced them. Wouldn't you love to imagine that you could fall in love with a ghost?
Well, you did point out the advantages. It's like,
there are many
it's like having a pet. They don't talk back, right?
Exactly.
And
what about
Madeleine,
you, Madeleine?
yeah, and you've actually, I mean, you've experimented a lot with genre, with form, right? And you actually, you created a new name for these sort of mini nonfiction pieces, right? Fractures. Am I remember that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. So So what's your relationship to the unreal or the parareal?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm interested in Carl Jung and Carl Jung's ideas of archetypes and the archetypal realm, which is always active and existent, but we don't always see it. And I like to kind of play with those boundaries in my work, where someone's maybe entering a dream, but the dream really feels incredibly real, or something really odd happens. And is it a hallucination or isn't it? We don't really know. It's almost like this archetypal dimension mirrors what's really going on in the real dimension that we live in.
Mhm.
But if we could see it, it would terrify us because, like the trees would be walking around and, all kinds of weird things would be happening. So, yeah, I kind of
Maybe
like
they
to
are.
play. Yeah. I like to play with that though. So, and just merge boundaries, and really try to, one thing I have to say, I do think that a lot of Canadian fiction is very reality bound and based. I find that a bit of a tragedy because, you read your literary magazines and quite often you won't see anything that's not realistic. And these boundaries are really interesting. I mean, there are truths there. There are truths there that you can get to in a way that maybe reality doesn't necessarily always serve.
Right, right. And Mary?
Well, that's such a good question because I think I wander into the mystic a lot. And I'm not sure that's a good thing, but I'm just really interested in letting the reins go, letting my reins go, letting your reins go, letting nobody have to be in a box of who they think they are in some concrete world, I'm very open to, and it's probably my love of the natural world, I suppose, and I was this afternoon walking in the rain and I coming at me on the path I was walking on was this massive great blue heron walking right at me, not afraid, not freaked out, didn't fly away. And then I saw a trumpeter swan. So I live in this, I think I live in this liminal space, frankly. And I like the looseness of it. I think, I probably think we come from the earth and we're going back to the earth, and what happens in between is not as concrete as we're made to think it is. So I really like things to have a looseness to them. And I have stories where I don't know, where does this come from? Where one of the narrators is an elephant, which doesn't sound, people that know me would not expect that. And where one of the narrators is a sparrow. And I think I just really like the fluidity of that, the openness of that, the not concreteness of that. I'm not a concrete person in that way. So that's, might not have brought appeal either, right? I mean, some people, like you said, Madeleine, we live in a world of very concrete stories in our country, I think, right? And I'm very much drawn to the stories of some of the South American writers and European writers that have more magical realism in their work. So I think it's what we're doing.
I think too that there are, that whole magical world, I think, does live alongside us. And if you travel a lot, what you see is that in other cultures, that other world is the same world as the world that we're in now. That the living and the dead are not so far apart at all. They exist almost in the same plane or on the same plane. And so, I think in Western culture, we're more, we tend to differentiate far more between these two worlds. But obviously in the South American world, or in anywhere where there are a lot of really long-standing beliefs in magic and in the spiritual world as real as the world that we're in now, coexisting with it. So that is a fascinating thing, I think. And, you know, maybe we're just training ourselves not to see it, but it's there.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you 100%.
So I think
Yeah.
as a final question before we go to audience questions, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about how you come to your characters. I think I think among you draw from very different segments of society, and I wonder, just maybe Madeleine, you could start. Like, how do you decide whose story to tell? What kind of characters fascinate you? What are you drawn to?
Well, in this particular collection, because it is Fontainebleau, the characters that inspired me were actually characters that I knew kind of in my childhood. You know, they're not the same people, but they were people that I, you know, certain aspects of their character are similar. And this was in the 1970s, and that's really the time on the book too. It's really set in the 70s. And these characters were, you know, Windsor's a very working class place, and many of them, of these characters, were also living in a kind of impoverished situation too. You know, so it was like a lot of them came from geared to income housing. You know, education wasn't, I mean, me either. I mean, we were all kind of in the same boat, right? It was like, and we were all kind of, a lot of us were trying to get out in different ways. Like some of them went and sold drugs to get out, right? You know, some of them went to university, right? And you know, but it was like we were all kind of in the same boat, like kind of pushed down by this impoverishment in this situation. But at the same time, I mean, I don't want to kind of denigrate that either. I mean, there's so much closeness in that, and there's so much camaraderie, and there's so much connection that you make with people. You know, you don't have that. There's all kinds of different dynamics that happen. But anyway, yeah, your question was what inspired my characters for this collection, and that's it.
And Mary or Jenny, how do you meet your characters?
You know, I just come back to this curiosity I have all the time, because you probably, if I know you read the book, Marilyn, and my characters range in age from a child to a 30-year-old man, to a 70-year-old woman, to a 50-year-old woman, to an elephant, to a sparrow and a milliner. They're all different ages, and some of them are men and some of them are women. And I think I'm just always wondering, why do people do what they do? That's kind of been with me since I was a child. You know, I watched somebody walk down the street today. It's 2 degrees here in basketball shorts, and I'm thinking, what's he thinking? And you know, that could be a story. Trust me. Strange things happen to me, and I'm always wondering, well, why would that person do that? And the fact that they might be 5 or 9 or 10 or 30 or 50 or 7 is irrelevant to me, completely irrelevant, because I think we're all, the age is not the thing, really. The thing is, what's going on for you, and how do you get to where you need to go? And I'm really overriding factor for me in my writing always is kind of redemption, and I think you see that in every single story. Forgiveness, and how we get to these places, you know. So, and everybody has to get there. You have to get there when you're 10. You have to get there when you're 20. You have to get there when you're 50. It might be a different hurdle. You might have a little more experience with it, but I think everybody's trying to get to a place where they know what their gift is. They know what they're good at. They know that they've been loved. Is kind of, that's the je ne sais quoi of what drives my stories. And it's like Madeleine. Madeleine, I grew up in Windsor.
Did you really? Oh, wow.
I did. It's the truth. But here we all are on the West Coast, so
We escaped.
Yes.
I've been there a long time.
And Jenny, what about you?
I would say, I'm listening. I'm fascinated by these because I think we all come to things so differently.
Yes.
Um,
I agree. Yeah.
I would say that I always come to everything. All writing for me, I come thematically to it. In other words, something happens and I know that there's something I want to discuss. I want to discuss an idea. So it's the idea. And then I sometimes let this percolate for months or whatever. It's just, I know that that's something I want to write about. And then one day the perfect character sort of occurs to me. I know how I'm going to do that. So I'll give you an example. When I was in Italy a couple of years ago, when we could still travel, oh my God. I wrote a little tiny thing about it, but I went to this particular place, a beautiful place in the Marche of Italy, and with some friends, and we went up we were going up a mountain to a particular lookout. So we drove way, 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 way up at the top of this mountain. There's a trail and you go off and look at things and look at this panoramic view. And at the end of this trail was a BMW with two young men in it. And it seemed like such an extraordinary thing because, I mean, why were they there so far in the middle of nowhere? And they were engrossed in talking. They were really engrossed in speaking. And so we went off past them, around them. We went off. We spent about an hour. When we came back, they were still there, but the windows were rolled down. And as we walked by to our car, we heard one of them say, "I only want to be with you." And so off we went, and we're thinking, what could this be? What is the story there? So we had, 100 different possibilities for this. Now, it seemed like such a wonderful moment. And eventually it did end up in a story. They were not the main characters of the story, but they were actually the main character, but they were, that particular incident isn't the main part of the story, but it made its way into the story with one character who says to the other, "I only want to be with you." So, somehow it's just a little tiny thing, but I was just thinking, and again, it's a story about longing and about wanting things to remain the same, and they don't, right? They change. So
I guess it's
that kind of thing, right?
I keep coming back to what Alice Munro said, right? It's all material.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all material.
And the way Atwood talks about it, we're all magpies, right? So we're always
everything goes.
Even when we don't know we are.
Yeah, we're picking up.
Yeah, I find sometimes ages later, like sometimes I'll be writing a story or something, and I'll think, oh, that piece I wrote, where is that? That little thing I wrote that I found somewhere, and suddenly it seems like, oh, this is where it fits. I just wrote it 2 years out of time, right?
So I think we have time for, maybe one, and if we're quick, two questions. There's, excuse me for leaning in, but I can't see very well. So the first one is, if you have themes you return to in your work, what are they? And why are they so important to you, if you're able to answer that? So I always think of it as a pebble in my shoe. I know I keep returning to that same pebble that's sort of worrying my foot. So do you have themes that you keep coming back to? Madeleine, do you?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the recurring themes in this collection, and I think it comes back in other works that I'm worked on, is there's this old Russian proverb, in all bad there's good, and I guess the theme is there's wholeness. We're always dealing with wholeness. Where we want to look, that's up to us. Do we want to see the good in it, or do we want to see the better, or do we want to see both sides? I know a lot of people have said my work is dark, right? And I mean, I get it, but the thing is, from that darkness, there is like an ability. There's something that allows you to transmute that darkness and see the light and see the brightness or the wholeness of that particular situation. So yeah, in
Well,
all bad there's good.
life has no definition without shadow, right? Otherwise, the picture's flat, right? The shadow is essential. Mary, do you have themes? Well, you've talked quite a bit about, I think, the recurring themes in yours already.
And I'm not going to go there now, but I was just thinking what Madeleine said, and it's so true, is I'm coming back to the William Blake, joy and woe are woven fine. We really just don't have one without the other. And people can say work is dark, but the two are just the same two sides of a coin, aren't they, really?
Yeah. And Jenny, do you have something that keeps coming
definitely. Definitely. I mean, I think, as it's been pointed out to me in many different ways, a lot of my work has to do with abandonment in various ways, not in exactly not physically the same way, but even when I write something I think is completely different, then I go and oh, there it is again, right? So I would say that would be one of my major themes. The other one, I think, is the idea of how temporal our lives are here, how really and this goes back to the earth as well, right? To the idea that the earth is, I mean, there's all those stratifications of earth, but that somehow the earth lives on and on. It's there. Millions of years later, you can go dig up, a fossil, and you're amazed. It's 2 million years old or something, and yet our lives, really, if you ask the people around you, not many can name their great grandmothers and great grandfathers by name, right? And so it's really like a couple of generations. We're here, and everything we do, we think is so important, but in a couple of generations, no one will remember we were even here. And so I find that's a fascinating thing of how do we leave our mark in the world, or do we even need to? Does it matter, right?
Right.
So,
and there's one more question from the audience that is a bit intriguing. So this is sort of a flash round because we really are close to the end now.
Okay.
And the question is, if Canadian literature did become more unreal, what might it look like? How might our vision differ from that in other countries? Say, different from a Gabriel Garcia Marquez or a Polish surrealism, or what do you think ours would look like?
I think it would look like Michael Ondaatje and Stephen Heighton and Helen Humphreys and all those amazing Canadians that are currently writing, that are poets as well, right? Who are writing this work that is so beautiful and non-linear and kind of trippy, and it would look like that.
I wonder if
either of you guys?
I would say, well, it might also, although I agree, obviously you're talking about some wonderful writers, but if we're looking forward to something coming that not that's there, but going forward, maybe it's going to look more into the technological world. Maybe Canada's quite a leader in a lot of technologies, and perhaps there will be, I don't know, something along that line. What we now consider sci-fi maybe won't be sci-fi at all. Nowadays you can have holograms that you can't tell are even holograms. They're just like people sitting in the room with you. So who knows what maybe that could be something
That's
maybe
interesting.
can,
Yeah.
yeah. Why
Any
not?
ideas, Madeleine?
Yeah, I'll just throw this out. I just think that whatever it would be would have to encompass nature in a very big way. Like,
Yeah.
I think the snow,
Mhm.
we'd have to snow spirits and tree spirits. And I think that it would, just our landscape, it would have to
Mhm.
embody our landscape in a way that, we don't really, our mainstream, anyway, the mainstream fantasy that we have here doesn't do that.
And I think
Although a lot-
I think our indigenous writers are bringing that into the literature in
I
a
think
really
you're
big
right,
way, and also writers who are coming from diverse backgrounds, and
yes.
Canadian, Mexican writers who end up in Canada, and Thai writers, and our Giller winner, right?
Giller winner from
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think I think those mix of cultures is going to see our. I agree with you, Madeleine, that it's we are so much about rocks and trees and lakes, right? That it'll be interesting to see how that's perceived through a different filter in the future. Well, thank you. My God, an hour gone, poof.
Nothing left.
Talk about unreality,
Guys, and thank you. Great.
So
Thank you.
Thank all of you for joining us. Thank Caitlin Press, and I'll do my thank yous, and then I'll do the draw. Okay. So somebody in the background is magically randomly selecting the winners, and while they're doing that, I will say again thank you to Caitlin Press for organizing this, and to Caitlin Press, Anvil Press, and Signature Editions for publishing these 3 wonderful books. I urge all of you to go out and buy them. Fontainebleau, Permanent Tourist, The Crooked Thing. Can you all hold up your books? Ta-da! There you go. Go out, buy these immediately. And thank you to the BC Council of the Arts, the Manitoba Council of the Arts, the Canada Council of the Arts, and the Government of Canada. And now I need to see, are there winners? Giveaway. Okay. Oh, now I have to lean really in. Okay. The winners are Jamie Zed, a copy of Permanent Tourist, Peggy Williamson, a copy of The Crooked Thing, and Leo Donati, Jenny's brother,
Yay.
a copy
Yay,
of Fontainebleau.
my brother.
That's so great.
Yay.
That's so great. And lucky me, I have them all. So all of you have some great reading ahead. I love stories. I think it's, I've only published 1 collection of stories, but for me as a reader, it's my favorite reading to dip into these elegant, brief, succinct lives and dip out again. So they last. Some stories have lasted longer with me than any novel. So congratulations to all of you, and I hope our paths cross again in the real world.
I hope so too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.